Hi, welcome to the factory. This is 106 Drip. It's a prep video for that class. So what that means is you're going to watch this video, take some notes, get ready. In a minute we're going to go down to the lab and we're going to walk through origin of coffee, where it comes from, how it gets processed, every step along the way before it gets to us. And then we're going to walk through how to make our V60 and our Aeropress. If you're ready, let's go.
First, we're going to talk about coffee processing because it's going to be really important and helpful for us as we taste coffees to understand where they came from and how they got to us. To begin, we want to know, how does coffee start out? What does it come from? And coffee is actually two beans inside of what's called a coffee cherry. It's a berry. I have a nice diagram here. A coffee cherry is made up of those two beans you see inside of it, surrounded by the silver skin, which is a really thin layer on the coffee. You actually can see silver skin on a lot of our light roast coffees when you grind them. It's that really flaky stuff that flies around and comes out of your grinder making a mess. Outside of the silver skin is a parchment. It's a really thick layer that actually stays on the bean for a large portion of the process as coffee is being processed. Outside of the parchment is mucilage, or the fruit of the coffee cherry, and on the outside of that is the skin to the coffee cherry. So processing is really the system that coffee needs to undergo in order to be ready for roasting. So there are three basic types. The first one is wash process, the next one is semi-washed, and the last one is a natural process. And these processes also have many different names. Wash process is called a water process, and you'll understand why in a second. Wash process is also the most common process we use at Stone Creek Coffee. It's the most commonly purchased coffee, I should say. We really like wash process because it tends to lend like a really cleanliness to the cup. Really nice acidity is highlighted in wash process coffees, and we get a really true picture of what the coffee tastes like in a wash process coffee. So wash process is when coffee farms pick their coffee, bring it to the mill, and at the mill they throw the coffee inside of a large pulping machine. And the pulper removes the skin and the fruit from the coffee cherry, and all that's left is the parchment and a thin layer of mucilage that's still on there. From the pulper, the coffee channels through down to a large fermentation tank. And in that fermentation tank, the coffee sits in its mucilage and water for a period of like 18 to 24 hours, depending on the mill. During this period, all of those fruits and acids are breaking down, and it's making it easier basically for the mucilage to come off of the cherry. So this is a really important part of removing the fruit so that what's left during the drying process is just the parchment and just the bean, and no fruit that could cause bad fermentation or like a poor drying. So from that large fermentation tank, after the 18 to 24 hours, coffee is then set out to dry, either on a large drying patio where it's turned regularly over the course of like a week to 2 weeks, depending on the process, or it could be moved to elevated beds. Elevated beds are usually made up of a mesh bottom, so coffee can sit on top of those elevated beds, and air can flow both above and below the coffee to allow it to dry really evenly. The last process might be, or for drying, might be dry or large drum roasting. So large mills can do this with large amounts of coffee. They can take a bunch of coffee and roast in much less time than 7 to 14 days on a large patio. So that's wash process. Coffee is going to dry on the patio until it reaches a 10% to 12% moisture content, at which point it's going to be dry milled, which is the removal of the parchment that's been on there that entire time, and then it's ready to go, ready to be shipped safely to a roaster such as ourselves. Again, that is wash process. Next process is a semi-washed process, and what happens here is that coffee is once again pulped in a large pulper. They remove a bunch of the fruit, but they never take it to a fermentation tank. They don't need to wash off all the fruit. They're actually going to allow it to dry inside of that fruit, or part of it, so that over the course of time, while the coffee is drying, it actually gets to take in some of that fruit flavor, and the body of the fruit gets imparted into the bean itself. So that's the fun thing about a semi-wash process coffee. It gets to impart some more fruit flavors into it. And then the natural process coffee is skipping the pulping process. So coffee just gets picked and dried inside of the fruit, the entire thing. And then after it's reached its proper moisture content of 10 to 12%, the mill removes everything in like a dry milling process that removes the parchment as well as the fruit and the skin. So there are some really nice benefits to the semi-wash process and the natural process where the fruit gets to stay on the coffee bean for a little bit longer and impart its sweetness and its fruitiness into it. However, there are lots of risks with like poor fermentation, things that can cause issues. It's mostly just due to the fact that there's an extended period of time where the bean is in a very high moisture content space, and that causes the poor fermentation issues to occur. Things like vinegary flavors that appear in our cup that we just don't want. So there's a lot of risk involved in using a process that is not washed process, which is why we tend to prefer our wash process coffees here at Stone Creek. They're really delicious, they're really clean, and they create a lot more consistency in the cup. Hi guys, now we're going to cover the V60. We're gonna learn how to brew a V60. And brewing a V60 starts with the special V60 filter. It's in the shape of a V. As the V60 is called V60, it's actually just the shape of the brewer is in the shape of a V, and it's at a 60-degree angle. So lots of really special things about that. We sell these filters in our cafe. They are special. They're very different from like those flat bottom cone filters that we sell for a Melita or that somebody might purchase for a Melita. But before you begin, you need to start by folding over this perforated edge. And then you go ahead and open up the filter. There's a nice little tab on there to help you do that, and place it inside of the V60. Next step is going to be rinsing our filter as well as heating up the V60 and the vessel that we're brewing with. I like to move the whole thing around in a circle so I can see what I'm wetting with my stream of hot water. This hot water came from our Fedco brewer. It's about 205 degrees and it's currently making our V60 really nice and warm, so we retain a lot of good heat. And that'll be important because a lot of heat is going to help us brew and extract evenly from the V60. So now I'm going to go and dump this rinse water out, and then I will fill up my kettle one more time with some really hot water, so we're always using hot water. To help you understand or remember what you need to do in order to brew a V60 in your space, or even the Aeropress, we have these lovely little cheat sheets that give you the instructions for brewing. I have the V60 one with me today, and we'll use it to help us walk through how to brew the V60. We also have grinder setting cards in your cafe. These will tell you how to grind your coffee on what number for any brew method that you're using. So on this card, it shows that the V60 needs to be ground at the size 14 on your EK grinder. To start, our V60 needs 24 grams of coffee in. So I actually pre-weighed out 26 grams of coffee because sometimes our lovely EK grinders could eat a little bit of it, and I want to make sure I have at least 24 grams of coffee available so I'm not underfilling my brew. Before adding my coffee to the V60, I'm going to turn on my scale and make sure that everything is set to 0. You can see that my scale is recording the V60, the filter, and the brew vessel as 0. And if it's not, I can just hit tare. Then I'll add my coffee to make sure that I only have 24 grams. So I'll go ahead and center my my brew vessel on there again. I'm going to lift this V60 up and even out my grounds bed so that I've got an even surface to use. And then before I start brewing, I'm going to tap the tare one more time so I'm set back to 0. Okay, and once I add my water, I'm going to start first with the very center of the bed, and I'm going to make a circular motion around going out toward the edges of the filter, but not actually hitting the filter. This first phase of brewing is called the bloom. And what I'm doing is trying to get all of the all of the water that we add, which is going to be 70 grams of water, to touch as much of the coffee as possible. Set our scale to the timer mode, and then I'm going to start the timer when I start adding my water. Okay, and we're going to go up to 70 grams. You can see I started from the center, I moved my way out. I'm almost there. And then I'm going to excavate my coffee. Excavating is just pulling up those dry grounds so that they receive moisture too. And we're going to allow that to sit for another few seconds until we reach a total time of 40 seconds, at which point we'll finish filling up to 360 grams. So right now, carbon dioxide is escaping, and we're allowing all of that water and coffee to come into contact with each other. At 40 seconds, I started again in the center, and I'm making circles around in a clockwise motion, which is the same direction as the swirls in your V60. Keep doing this until we reach that 360 gram mark. Whoop, little hesitant here. There we go. And at that point, I'm going to do one quick stir around the top, just to keep the water flowing in that circular clockwise motion. Once we reach 1.5 minutes, I'll lift up the vessel and set it down carefully, but I'm trying to jar the grounds to make sure that they're still in a really nice even layer at the bottom of my brew. Almost there. Okay, and then all we have to do is wait for that water to finish falling through the grounds, and once it does, we're gonna have a completed brew, and we can taste it. All right, guys, it's time to learn how to brew the Aeropress. So Aeropresses are fun. They are made of multiple pieces, which could be a little scary or confusing, but no big deal. We'll walk you through it. We actually do a method of brewing with the Aeropress that's called an inverted brewing method. There are many different ways to use this brew method, but again, we're doing inverted. So I'm going to create some names of the parts of the Aeropress that we're using today. This is going to be called the plunger. We're going to use it to plunge. And then we're going to use the basket, which has a filter in it already, for filtering our coffee. And then the third part is the chute. I call it a chute because the coffee shoots through it. All right. So to begin, we're going to actually set up the Aeropress. This would be the Aeropress right side up. So I'm going to pretend like it's right side up and put the plunger in part of the way up to just below the 4. And I flipped it upside down. I'm going to set it down. And then I'm going to go ahead and put our very special little circle Aeropress filter inside of the basket and rinse it right away with really nice hot water. And I can do this over the Aeropress or just over the brew vessel. I'm going to do it over the Aeropress to preheat our plastic Aeropress, which I'm not doing super cleanly. Woo. That's all right. Get it nice and rinsed and warm, and then I'll set this basket to the side and clean up my mess because we have to make sure everything is clean. All right. Once I've done that, I've pre-weighed out some coffee. Again, our Aeropress starts with 20 grams of coffee in, but I weighed out 22 grams again in case my grinder eats some of my coffee. So I'm going to go ahead, grind that coffee up, and be right back. So I didn't mention this before, but I ground our coffee at the 8 setting, which I can see on my grind setting card. I ground my coffee to the size 8 on our EK. So then I've placed our Aeropress, the upside down Aeropress, on the scale, and I'll turn it on so that the weight is just torn out automatically. And I'm going to weigh out my coffee, making sure I'm only adding 20 grams of coffee to the Aeropress. So now that I've got the coffee in there and I know I have the right amount of coffee in there, I can tear out my scale. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually start to add water. So the Aeropress gets 20 grams of coffee in, and then we're going to bloom it with 80 grams of water. and then finish brewing with a final weight of water of 200 grams. So, ready to begin. I'll add my first 80 grams for the bloom, starting my timer. I like to spin the Aeropress a little bit while I do this so I can saturate all those grounds. And I'll let the bloom go for 30 seconds, at which point I'll stir and then finish filling to the final weight of 200 grams. For stirring, I get to use our fancy Aeropress paddle. Doesn't need to be too aggressive. All right, we'll fill all the way up to 200. Blap. And at 1 minute, I'll stir, put the basket on top, and push down. Okay, stir, basket on top, and make sure you twist it in so it's secure. So I'm going to flip my Aeropress over and push down until I start to hear the air escape, at which point I want to stop pressing so that I do not risk over extracting my coffee. All right, air escaping, all good. Water's been pushed out, and there it is. We've got our 7 ounces of delicious Aeropress coffee. All right, so we just learned how to brew the V60 and the Aeropress, but now it might be important to understand why we were doing what we were doing. And I talked through some of that a little bit as we went. But in order to really understand a little more science behind brewing, we need to know what the 6 key brewing variables are. And those are grind size, ratio of water to coffee, water quality, water temperature, the filter, and then agitation or pacing is what we might call it. So let's start with grind size. Coffee particles, when ground up, need to be a consistent grind size, but also the right grind size for the brew method. If we're going to have a brew method that has a really long contact time with water, like a French press, we're going to grind our coffee really nice and coarse, because that is going to reduce the amount of chemical reactions that occur between the hot water and the coffee during that time. If we're going to do something that's really fast, like an Aeropress or espresso, we're going to grind our coffee really, really fine so that our coffee can go ahead and extract, or so that water extracts from the coffee as much coffee as possible in a short period of time. So increasing the amount of surface area is also going to increase the rate at which those reactions can happen and in which we can extract coffee from the coffee. Then we're going to want to talk about ratio. So you want to have the right amount of water to coffee. One of the most common coffee to water ratios is 1 to 15. 1 part coffee, 15 parts water. That is the ratio that we use for our V60 recipe, but it's not the ratio we use for our Aeropress recipe. So sometimes we step outside of those bounds, but whatever it takes in order to have a really nice balanced cup and to reach a TDS, which is total dissolved solids, of about 0.04, which is like 4% of your coffee ending up as coffee. And so what I mean by that is when you brew with water and have the water flow through the coffee, in the end you end up with brewed coffee. And that brewed coffee is actually only about 4% solubles from the ground coffee. The rest of it's water. So the ratio that we pick is actually going to play a role in what that final TDS, or the total dissolved solids, in your coffee is. And speaking of TDS, why do you think we need to have really great water quality? Well, because 96% of my cup of coffee is actually water. So if my water tastes weird, or if it has like extreme hardness, or if it's an extremely soft water, I'm going to be able to taste that in my coffee, and it's also going to impact the way that the water brews the coffee. If I've got too much stuff in my coffee or in my water, I'm likely to be inhibited in the way that I'm extracting my coffee. So water quality, really important. If your water tastes weird, your coffee is definitely going to taste weird. And that's actually one of the reasons that so many of us at home will fail at brewing coffee. It's really hard to dial in our coffees if we have, like maybe if we live outside of the city limits of Milwaukee, where where water has like a really high parts per million, something like 500 parts per million. Ideally, we want like 200 or less. The SDA recommends water to have something in it, to have some little level of calcium and some level of hardness, but not too much. And too much is really where we start to go wrong in a lot of our faucet waters. So if you want to, you could always at home purchase something like a purified water or a mineral water. Next, we want to talk about more water stuff, water temperature. Ideal for brewing is going to be anywhere from 195 degrees Fahrenheit to 205 degrees Fahrenheit. Keep in mind that we want to really stay toward that upper part of the brewing temperature, 205. And in order to do that, we preheat a lot of the things we're working with. We preheat our kettles, our actual brew method, and our brewing decanter, because we want to maintain that nice high temperature throughout the entire brew, so that we can extract really well. Too low of a temperature of water is going to inhibit us from extracting everything we want. Next, filter. We brew with about 2 different filter mediums, either the espresso metal filter or a paper filter of some kind. So in your cafe, we use paper a lot. The Aeropress filter, the V60, and the COD filter are all paper filters. And these are really great mediums to brew through because they keep out a lot of extra oils from the brew, and they provide a pretty clean cup. The metal filter is great. The French press has a metal filter, and it allows through a few more oils and even a little bit more sediment in the cup. So that's really going to impact the flavor of your coffee when you're done. So if even you're at home and you're brewing or playing with a different kind of filter, it'd be interesting to see what that does to your final brew. Lastly, agitation or pacing. So in our V60 recipe, we pull up some grounds in order to expose them to the moisture of the bloom. In the Aeropress recipe, we stir our grounds with the coffee in order to expose the water to the grounds. This is really important in order to get that moisture to hit the water or to hit the coffee all at the same time. And it really helps to even out the final extraction, because if the water and the coffee come into contact with each other at approximately the same time, all of our coffee is likely to be extracted very similarly throughout our brew process. So we might choose methods of agitating in order to allow that to happen, but the other part of agitation and pacing is pacing. So how long the water is actually in contact with your coffee. If you allow the water and the coffee to be in contact for too long, you likely run the risk of over-extracting your coffee. If you don't allow them to be into contact with each other for long enough, you're going to under-extract your coffee. And under-extracting is just not extracting enough. Which brings us to my last point. I want to talk a little bit about over and under extraction. We covered this some in our 104 espresso class, but over extraction is usually, you can taste over extraction when you taste bitterness. Under extraction, you can taste it when you have a high level of acidity in your final cup. So keep that in mind. If you're brewing your COD or you brew a V60 and you taste these things in your cup, you can have a better idea of like, uh-oh, I think that my brew method went too long for some reason, and this might help you understand what went wrong during the brew process. All right, y'all. Today we talked about coffee processing. We learned how to brew the V60, the Aeropress. We covered our brew variables and learned a little bit about why coffee brews the way that it does and why we do the things we do here at Stone Creek Coffee. Please, if you have questions or if you really want to remember how to brew the V60 or the Aeropress, just rewind and rewatch that portion of the video so that you can really implant it into your brains. You'll come into your spaces and you'll actually come into class and you'll practice doing it with an educator or with a master barista or with your coach or like an awesome coworker at some point. But watching it a few times before coming in is really going to help solidify it into your brains. We also have the quiz after this, so please watch that. as well as some possible reading that would be involved in this class too. So please prepare, get ready to come in and learn, and then go into the cafes and make some customers super happy with delicious V60s, Aeropresses, and like just coffee knowledge. So thanks so much. See you later.